Welcome and thank you for joining us. Now, many of us will have experiences of dealing with parents who are suffering from one of the diseases that cause dementia, and will have seen the impact that dementia has on a family. We may also be concerned for ourselves and the impact on our families as we get older. In this short session, we'll explore reasons to be optimistic in the fight against these diseases, to understand what steps we can take to protect ourselves and actions that we can be taking today to provide peace of mind with respect to the future and how we can support the good work being undertaken. My name is Stuart Cummins. I'm the Chief Executive of Nedbank Private Wealth. I'm joined by Hilary Evans, Chief Executive of Alzheimer's Research UK, and Professor James Rowe, Chair of Strategic Advisory Board, Professor of Cognitive Neurology at the University of Cambridge, and a practicing neurologist. So, Hilary, if I could perhaps start with you. For those people not as familiar with Alzheimer's Research UK, perhaps you could provide a brief overview.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stuart, and it's great to be here with you today. Alzheimer's Research UK are the leading dementia research charity, not just in the UK, but increasingly globally. We are here and dedicated to finding treatments for people with dementia. So we fund medical research across the UK and globally. So we fund some of the best research in the world to help us understand more about the diseases that cause dementia, how we'll be able to prevent them, stop them, and cure them. At the moment, dementia is the leading cause of death in the UK, and there's nothing that we can do to halt or stop its progression. So that is the purpose of us as an organisation, and it's lovely to be able to talk a little bit more about some of our work.
Excellent. And so tell me, Hilary, what are some of the steps that people can take to minimise the risks of developing dementia?
So the more that we've understood about the diseases that cause dementia, and when I talk about diseases that cause dementia, Alzheimer's disease is maybe the most commonly known disease that causes dementia, but we've also got vascular dementia or dementia with Lewy bodies. And we know that actually a number of cases of dementia could potentially be reduced if we can change or modify some of our risk factors. So these risk factors are often things like taking regular exercise through midlife, keeping healthy, so keeping a good diet, and understanding what we can do to try and keep our brains healthy through Alzheimer's Research UK's brain health campaign, Think Brain Health, has been really successful in the last couple of years, because I think that one of the things that we often don't necessarily think about our brain is actually how we look after our brain. It's one of the most important organs that we have, and we've got quite good at looking after our heart health. But actually, a lot of the things that help look after our heart health are actually very good for our brains as well. So these are sorts of things that actually from midlife onwards, if we can maintain regular exercise, keep our blood pressure low, have a healthy diet, keep our weight in check, all of those things are really going to help in terms of being potentially helping prevent some of these diseases, but are going to help our body deal with them a lot better if we do get to that stage. So we are talking a lot around prevention, but ultimately what we want to find are treatments that, if given early enough in the course of the disease, will be effective, that people essentially won't go on to develop something like Alzheimer's disease later on in life.
Right, okay. So perhaps Professor Rowe, if I could bring you in at that stage then, perhaps what progress is being made in our understanding of the diseases that cause dementia?
Yeah, well, it's a very rapid and exciting time in dementia research. There's clear progress towards better diagnosis, treatments, and that all-elusive cure further down the road. But I think imminently there's prospects of better prevention. And this has come from a realization that the term dementia is really an umbrella term for a family of different illnesses. Now, those differences are important to us as individuals, get a right diagnosis, but they also have some things in common, some things that we could intervene to treat, the way that junk proteins can build up in the brain, there's inflammation, blood supply issues, and changes with really the way that the brain is reacting to changes in our whole body. Hilary's touched on some of those that would empower steps we could take individually and as a society for prevention. but also through biomedical research to target those individual mechanisms or causes of different dementias, and they're being chipped away at really, quite rapidly now. I think the rarer but devastating genetic forms of dementia, although they're rare, they're really spearheading the way towards definitive treatments, things that would be really revolutionary in terms of preventing the illness and halting it in its tracks when it starts. But from there, other more common forms of dementia, like Alzheimer's disease, will soon follow. The reason I say that with confidence is it's clear that dementias, although they have some complexity, they're fundamentally no different from any other major biomedical challenges: cancer, COVID, heart disease, HIV, all of which have been solved to a large extent by investment in research and engagement of the whole population in that fight against the illness. And dementia will follow the same path. There's no reason why it should not do so.
And so that investment in research, I mean, that requires obviously a significant funding to be able to provide that research. Do you feel like the funding that has gone into this area has been sufficient, or has COVID had an impact on funding being diverted away from Alzheimer's or dementia or related?
So I think the funding that has been put forward has been extremely well spent. It's extremely efficiently used to understand the biology of the disease in a way that will lead to new treatments and better diagnosis. So it's extremely efficiently used. But if we think about it as a fraction of the cost of dementia, which is roughly 30 billion a year to the UK, 150 billion across the EU, and it's not even a fraction of 0.1% is spent on research, and it would make a huge difference for that to be increased. I think we as a community of researchers know how best to use such investment in better diagnosis and different sorts of treatment for the different kinds of dementia. But the research investment can't be, it can't be done without that investment. There's also some investment of what we can individuals do, investing our own time and efforts in our families to look after our brain health and to engage with research activities as volunteers. Some of those steps we can take as individuals, Hilary's touched on, things that are good for the heart, we're all more familiar with over the last couple of decades. They're also good for the brain. But some things may be less obvious. For example, hearing and education and pollution. These are things that require individual and policy changes that would really go a long way to preventing our individual risk of dementia.
Hilary, would you have a follow-up to the points that James has just made?
I would, yeah. I think one of the big challenges for treating some of these diseases is essentially trying to detect and diagnose them early enough. And historically, we haven't maybe been able to diagnose at the stage that we can effectively treat this disease. So we've really been trying to, I guess, shift the conversation and think about how we as a society think about dementia. So it's always been thought of something that happens when you get older. For a lot of people, it's this sort of fatalism around the disease. It's a inevitable part of aging. There's nothing that we can do. And actually for Alzheimer's Research UK, that is absolutely not the case. That is why we exist. And actually one of the key sort of messages I think that we've been talking to the public about and individuals is that point where there is something that you can do. And as James and I have been saying, there's something that you can do in terms of helping reduce your risk, but actually supporting medical research in this area is probably going to be one of the most fulfilling things that you can potentially do in your lifetime, because actually we will get to the stage where we can treat this disease effectively. But what we need to do is understand at what point we're diagnosing it. And actually we're able to diagnose at the moment when people have symptoms. So, we'll all be probably relatively familiar with some of the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, of people forgetting things and their memory not being what it was, and cognitive challenges. And obviously they get progressively worse, and all we can do at the moment is support and care for those people, often for sort of 10 to 15 years while they're living with the disease. But actually what we want to do is to shift it back 10 to 15 years. So actually start trying to detect and diagnose before people have symptoms, and therefore we will be able to treat this disease much more effectively. So it's a little bit like with cancer. Actually, we all now know that if we can catch cancer quick and we can spot some of those early signs, actually we're going to be quite effective at treating the vast majority of cancers these days. And that's something that's changed in the last 20 to 30 years. And actually what we need to do is detect and diagnose 10 to 15 years before we are now when it comes to diseases that cause dementia. And then we can effectively treat them, because actually what we can't do is effectively treat Alzheimer's disease when essentially someone already has a lot of the damage that's happened in their brain. We can't reverse that damage, but what we can do is to stop that damage taking place in the first place. And I think that's, for me, one of the most sort of empowering messages about this is actually there is a huge amount that we now know that is enabling us to really shift how we think and talk about this disease. But scientifically, that'll position us in terms of getting the treatments as they start to come through, which they will do in the coming years, to the people that really need them at the point that they need them. And that's where someone like James in his clinical role and in his academic role are really starting to see that change.
And just reflecting on that, so many of the people watching this webinar may have parents that are suffering with the illness, and they will see the devastation that causes, and perhaps they will be concerned that their generation, when they reach the age of the parents, will be in a similar situation. So some of the points that you've outlined sound to me as there is an opportunity within the next generation to make a significant shift in early diagnosis and indeed treatment. So Professor Rowe, maybe if I could come back to you then. So tell me a bit about, could you share a little bit around that, the work that's going on now, and that your optimism that the next generation might be in a better informed and situation.
So a big ground of optimism is the greater awareness of dementia. It's hard to avoid. 1 in 3 of us are at risk of this illness, but there's actually greater awareness and awareness that it's potentially treatable. And if in doubt, one should come forward to initially perhaps through the GP and onto memory assessment services. It might be to do with dementia. There may be other conditions that are causing memory not to work so effectively. So come forward without stigma, without fear, and try and be in charge of one's own health and brain health, to look after one's illness, look after one's brain health and deal with any illnesses early on. Now, those memory clinics and the memory assessment services have a much greater set of tools at their disposal now compared to 10 years ago to give an accurate, a useful form of diagnosis, and one that may lead to a variety of different either treatments or preventative steps. This involves some of the advances in technologies of brain scanning, but also technologies in genetics and genetic risk and blood tests. One of the things that's become very clear in the last few years is that the underlying changes in the brain that give dementia don't start when we get memory symptoms. They start 10, 20, maybe even 30 years beforehand, which gives a very long window of opportunity to pick up that illness when you feel well, you feel normal. There's everything to be gained by treating it, but to pick up the illness and to stop it in its tracks, to treat it effectively, preventatively, before symptoms arise. So this long window of opportunity is extremely important. And it's something I think and that applies to all of the different dementia illnesses. So one should be aware, feel no stigma and come forward for an assessment and be in charge of one's own future brain health. And that will be ready to pick up on the breakthroughs in individual treatments, things that one's doctor might prescribe. I know people are very interested in what might become as a drug or similar. Those are coming, many in clinical trials, others with a strong rationale coming. But there's lots that we can do here and now.
Excellent, thank you. And Hilary, maybe if I could come to you, perhaps there's a certain amount of myths and confusion around the work that's undertaken by or the disease of Alzheimer's and dementia. What are the sort of key myths that you like to debunk when you're trying to educate people on the work that's undertaken by Alzheimer's Research UK?
Yeah, I think there are, and I think probably the key one is, as one I mentioned briefly a moment ago, is just this feeling that it's an inevitable part of aging. It's just something that happens when we get older, and it's something that some people are going to have to cope with, and others magically don't. But actually, that isn't true. This is caused by disease, and I think that actually just talking about the fact that this condition is caused by disease is something that does change how people perceive dementia and Alzheimer's disease and some of the other diseases that we're talking about. Because I think that when we start talking about disease, actually, as James was saying, you know, we've cracked so many diseases with medical research, and we're doing the same here. Historically, dementia research has been relatively underfunded compared to the impact that it has on society and on people. And I think part of that probably has been the sort of attitude as it being seen as something that is quite inevitable when it really isn't. And what we want to do is to ensure that this is disease where there are effective treatments, and those treatments need to ensure that we have a way of tackling this disease and the causes of this disease rather than just trying to treat the symptoms. And I think that fatalist approach kind of then runs through everything we're trying to do. So actually, as an organisation, I think that's the sort of biggest myth that we can bust. I think the fact that there are things that we can do to reduce our risk of developing some of these diseases, again, is something that people haven't necessarily been able to engage with or thought about. Or actually there've been the kind of awareness and education around that. So I think actually as individuals and a health system, actually there's a lot that we can do starting in midlife to reduce your risk. But I think the other piece is actually there's a lot that we can do as individuals in terms of just supporting medical research and being part of this solution. And as you were saying, actually, it really is the next generation that could be the ones that are going to benefit from this research. But actually, society as a whole is going to benefit, because actually what we don't want is our children going on to develop these diseases in later life. Actually, there's a lot we can do for our own generation. And there are still things that we are able to do for an older generation who might be in some of the earlier stages, just in terms of making it, you know, a sort of part of a diagnosis pathway that you would be involved in research and clinical trials. So in the same way that if you had a cancer diagnosis, one of the first conversations often people have is, what clinical trials are, how can I take part in research, how can other people benefit maybe from this diagnosis, as earth-shattering it is for the patient themselves. And that doesn't always happen with dementia. It's quite patchy across the UK, depending on your clinician or your hospital or where you're getting diagnosed. So I think there are things then that people can do, and I think that's then the myth that there isn't that sort of hope. And I think that for me, talking to our scientists, talking to some of the clinicians, actually there's never been more hope when it comes to dementia research in terms of some of the breakthroughs that are coming through scientifically, from what we're able to fund and the sorts of science that's out there, and just some of that thinking then coming together as to how we reposition the challenge with this disease. And I think we've learned quite a bit actually in terms of how we've dealt with COVID. We've been looking actually quite closely at the sort of COVID task force and a different way of running clinical trials, and really trying to be a little bit faster paced and innovative in terms of how we take on some of these big medical challenges, which, you know, years ago people didn't think you could come up with a coronavirus vaccine, and actually scientists managed to do that and delivered it, and delivered it to millions and millions of people around the world very quickly and effectively. And we want to see that same sort of pathway when it comes to dementia. Essentially, I think we have that kind of urgency. You know, the leading cause of death where there's nothing that we can do, it just shouldn't be the case. And so I think for us, we want to keep that momentum and keep that pressure up, but we need the funding to be able to get there.
So I'll talk to Professor Rowe in a moment about the sort of clinical trials and perhaps how people can opt in, or what advice you'd have for those. But let's stay on the theme of the sort of financial support for the research, Hilary. So if there's people that are listening to this and this is really resonating with them, and they want to have an impact on the work that's taking place, how can they get involved? How can they support Alzheimer's Research UK?
Well, there's a number of ways that you can support Alzheimer's Research UK. We are a charity that rely 100% on donations from the public. And so one of the most effective ways often that people can support the work of the charity is through leaving a gift in their will. So we have got some literature available about how you can go about doing that, but that's obviously a very effective way of being able to fund future research and give a real lasting legacy to dementia research in the next generation. But there are a number of other ways that you can support us in terms of your individual fundraising in your community through your company. So I would recommend people go to Alzheimer's Research UK's website and have a look at how you can support us.
Excellent, thanks Hilary. And James, perhaps if I can follow up the point that Hilary made around clinical trials, an individual's engaged with the GP, that they've had a sense of diagnosis, how can they support the efforts? Could you perhaps help understand?
So here we go. I think there's something for everybody here, whether you have a diagnosis or whether you're simply supporting somebody else with a diagnosis, or whether just in full health, you wish to help others altruistically. There are ways that all of us can be helping clinical trials. I think the simplest single point of contact will be an organisation called Join Dementia Research, which ARUK works closely with and has many research studies linked to Join Dementia Research. And that forms almost like a brokering agency to put you in touch with researchers looking for different people, perhaps based on the diagnosis, which part of the country you live in, how much or how little time you feel you can contribute. How can you be connected with researchers? Much of that research is being directly led and supported by ARUK, but I think the Joint Dementia Research is a single point of contact will take you a long way. Whether you're healthy or have a diagnosis yourself, or merely supporting a third party who has a diagnosis, there's something for everybody to do here.
Excellent, that's very, very useful guidance. Thank you very much. So really, in summary, we've explored there that there seems to be reasons to be optimistic, and we understand that the steps that we can take to protect ourselves, actions that we can be taking today to provide a peace of mind with respect to the future, and also very practical ways in which we can support the good work being undertaken by Alzheimer's Research UK. Hilary, we will ensure that we include further resources on our website and links to documents to all of the websites that were mentioned. I will also ask Simon Prescott, one of our wealth planning team, to do a separate session to maybe talk through the financial implications of how to plan through these circumstances and to make sure that your family are financially provided for, irrelevant of what happens in the future. So with that, I'd just finally like to thank Hilary for joining us today, and Professor James Rowe. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and I'm sure all of our clients and contacts and introducers that listen to this will find it incredibly inspiring, the work that's undertaken by Alzheimer's Research UK. Thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.